Chapter 6. Georgie's fever ran high for 5 full days, and during most of that time he tossed about in delirium, unaware of the need to protect the unhealed wounds on his back. With the resultant stinging which spread all over his back and buttocks, a picture of Steve materialized in his brain and filled him with terror. At such time Georgie's shrieks were terrible to hear, and Sister Mary Angela's face was drawn as she bent over him trying to soothe and comfort him. At other times it was the safety of the rosebush that disturbed him. He saw it in his dreams, thrown like trash beside the calla lilies and scorned by proud flowers that turned into jeering boys. "Hello, ugly," they whispered at first so that none of the sisters could hear them. "Who beat the hell out of you, ugly?" The voices then grew so loud at times that Georgie went wild with the din they set up in his brain, and as if she wanted to add to his distress, a woman with blazing eyes and long yellow whips of hair over her shoulders advanced toward the rosebush. What she intended to do with it was all too plain as she picked it up and dragged it away toward barrels filled with litter. It was this vision of the woman that renewed the threats Georgie had made in the garden. "I'll burn your house. I'll kill you dead," he told the Molly Harper of his delirium, while the real Molly Harper stood at Sister Mary Angela's side and tried to soothe him. On the 6th day his fever subsided, and he seemed much better until he recognized Molly bending over his bed. His eyes widened with fear at the sight of her, and he turned his back, shrinking as far away from her as possible. Sister Mary Angela came to his bed after Molly left and sat beside him. "Mrs. Harper has been helping Dr. Blake and me take care of you, Georgie. She has been kind." He shuddered. "I hate her. She'll hurt my rosebush again. I know she will. I'm so much afraid of her." "You've been sick for quite a long time, Georgie. I think the fever has made you have bad dreams." She said he'd been sick a long time. Anything could have happened in a long time. He looked at Sister Mary Angela with despair in his eyes. "You can tell me. She's thrown my bush away, ain't she? Like the janitor did that night in the apartment." "If you will listen, Georgie, I'll tell you about your rosebush. Old Eddie made a bed for it over on this side of Mrs. Harper's garden. He put in the kind of food roses need and plenty of water. Your bush is standing over there waiting for you to get well and visit it. Nothing is going to hurt it. Mrs. Harper will never pull it up again." The words were too good. They were like the words, "We'll never let Steve come here again. My boy won't have to be afraid anymore." He suddenly hated Sister Mary Angela the way he hated his mother. "You are an old liar," he said angrily. "You are saying lies to me." He pulled the sheet over his head and burrowed far down beneath it, crying and refusing either to listen or speak to her. After a while, when he was quieter, she spoke to him again. "I've brought Timothy in to see you, Georgie. He wants to say hello." Slowly he uncovered his head and looked up at his visitor. Timothy grinned uneasily at him. "I got something to tell you, Georgie. All of us watched old Eddie plant your rose. Me and Sister and Robin's grandfather and Mrs. Harper. Even fat old Coca-Cola Amanda brought little Robin down. We wanted to tell you about it, but you was too sick to listen." "You believe Timothy, don't you, Georgie?" Sister Mary Angela interrupted in a calm voice. "You don't believe that Timothy is an old liar, do you?" Georgie felt ashamed. "Nobody here is an old liar, except her," he added stubbornly. "She allowed your rosebush to be planted in her garden, Georgie. The grandfather made her do it, I know he did, him and maybe the little boy." Timothy started to speak, but Sister Mary Angela shook her head at him. "We'll talk about it when Georgie is stronger, Tim. Let's do our chores now and let him sleep for a while." They walked away together, and Georgie lay, uneasy and wondering, but less agitated. Late that afternoon, Sister Mary Angela let him sit up in a wheelchair and pushed him out on the side porch, which faced the garden. "Look straight ahead, Georgie, just down beyond the gate." There's your bush standing up tall, looking better than it's ever looked since you brought it here. Do you see it?" He drew a long breath, half in relief, half in a fear that wouldn't quite leave him. "Will she hurt it some night when we're asleep?" he asked, hoping to be reassured. "No one will hurt your bush, absolutely no one. I give you my word. If I thought anyone were going to destroy it, I'd go out and do something about it. Can't you trust me?" He nodded slowly. "Can't we go over and talk to it?" "We must wait till you're stronger. I think in a few days you and I can walk over and have a visit with your friend." "I think I'm well enough right now," he said, but he admitted to himself when he was back in his room that his bed felt good after being out of it for a while, that even the short trip to the porch had left a tiredness in him. The tiredness was somehow good, though. He lay in the clean white bed, relaxed and contented, glad to be alone and able to have a waking dream of what it would be like when he could be close to his bush again. After pain and a fear that had stayed with him constantly until it wore him out and made his body sick, after all the terrible days, his rosebush was safe, and because of that it was safe for him to rest. Sister Mary Angela did not lie. He should have known she was not like his mother. She did not lie, and he felt safe in believing that his rose was now where it belonged in the beautiful garden that was like a page in his flower book. It didn't matter that the garden belonged to her. The part of his brain that brought restful, waking dreams to him pushed Mrs. Harper far away from his thoughts. A few days later, Sister Mary Angela took him across the building to a room she called the chapel. She wheeled him to a side door along one of the halls, and they were suddenly on a sort of balcony that was called the choir loft. Below them was a large room full of empty seats. "This is where you will sit with the other boys when you come to vesper service," she said, pointing down to the empty room. "Today I've brought you up here where we can talk for a while." She allowed him to get out of the wheelchair and sit beside her on a low bench near the organ. "I often come up here when I want to rest, or when I'm troubled." He looked up at her without answering. She, too, was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Do you know about God, Georgie?" "No," he said, and added, "Do you know about him?" "I often come up here to talk with him." "He's not in this room, is he?" "He can hear us anywhere if we really want to talk with him." "What do you talk about?" he asked, looking at her curiously. "I ask him sometimes to help me understand the world around me." She paused as if she were thinking, as if she needed to find words. "The world is beautiful in so many ways, but it is very cruel, too, in many other ways. There are such things as children being cold and hungry, being hurt by people with twisted minds. I get angry sometimes, and I ask him to help me understand why these things should be." "The world is bad, all of it," he muttered. Then he remembered. He said, "All but my rosebush. It's good." She was silent again for a while. Then she asked, "If you could ask God to do something for you, Georgie, what would it be?" His answer came without hesitation. "Have a policeman kill Steve and Miss Cressman and her," he said, anger coming back to his eyes. Sister Mary Angela raised her eyes to the ceiling. "I think we are not yet attuned to thy presence," she said quietly. Her voice was very low, but Georgie heard her. "What did them words mean?" he asked. "In a way, I was just telling God that I'm sorry you can't forgive Mrs. Harper." He did not reply at first. Then he said, "She hurt my rose bush. She said mean things. You'd better tell him that." She suddenly seemed to think they should talk about something else. "Do you like to listen to music, Georgie?" "I ain't never listened," he answered. She rose and went up to seat herself at the organ. "Well, I love music the way you love flowers. Sometimes I like to come up here and play the organ so that I can relax and forget the things that may be troubling me. You listen and see if you like my music." Her hands touched the keys and they made a quiet singing for a few minutes. Then she pushed some of the little squares in front of her, and the singing swelled until it filled the whole chapel and echoed as if there was a great happiness inside the organ, and it was telling everyone who listened that not quite all the world was bad. Georgie caught his breath as the music grew louder and sweeter. When it finally turned to a whisper and then stopped altogether, he looked up at Sister Mary Angela with wonder. "How can you make it sound like that?" he asked. "Because I've trained my fingers for many years," she answered, "and because I love music so much." There was a catch in his voice as he spoke. "It's nice," he said. She smiled at him. "Yes, I'm glad you liked it, Georgie." As they prepared to go back to his room, Georgie turned to her again. "Can I come back and hear the music sometime?" "Of course." Georgie noticed that her eyes looked full of happiness about something. The next day, Timothy came up to Georgie's room and sat with him for an hour. Georgie was strained and uneasy with his collar at first, but no one stayed uneasy with Timothy for very long. Sister Mary Angela called him her public relations boy. Timothy had no idea what she meant by that, but he assumed from her tone that it was good. "It was nice that Mrs. Harper let your rosebush be planted in her garden, wasn't it, Georgie?" he asked. Georgie's dark eyes glinted. "The little boy's grandfather made her do it," he said grimly. Then honesty made him add, "Anyway, I think that's what happened." Timothy was thoughtful for a minute. "She used to be friendlier. That was before Paul and his dad got killed. She used to say hi to us once in a while. And once she had a birthday party for Paul. All of us that was about his age got to go." "Did you ever go over there just to play with the boy?" For some reason, Georgie did not wish to say Paul. "Sure, a few times. Paul invited me to go swimming with him in the lake one time. Me and Kevin, I think it was. And one other time I went with Paul when he took Robin down to feed the duck family on the lake." Timothy laughed at something he remembered. "That was a big deal for Robin. He'd hold tight to Paul's hand and yell and try to jump up and down when he saw the ducks fighting over the bread we threw to them." Georgie smiled. "He's a nice little kid, I guess." "Yeah," Timothy pulled at his ear and frowned. "Yeah, he's all right, but you have to be awful patient with a kid like Robin. He wouldn't be still 5 minutes when me and Paul wanted to sit in the playhouse their grandfather made for them in the banyan tree. We wanted to talk a while and make plans for building a birdhouse, but Robin kept bugging us to take him back to the lake so he could see the ducks." "Did you ever build the birdhouse?" Georgie asked. Timothy shook his head. "The week after I was there, Paul got killed." The memory seemed to make Timothy sad. He rose to leave shortly afterward. "Sister said I mustn't wear you out." He extended his hand for the handshake he had been taught to make upon leaving. Georgie had shaken hands only a few times before, never with another child. He was shy and somewhat embarrassed, but pleased too. He liked Timothy. By the next day he was beginning to fret at not being able to go over to the garden. "I feel so good, Sister. Why can't I go over and see my rosebush?" he asked as soon as she came in to see him. "The doctor thinks that you can go out for a while tomorrow. Let's rest now and be ready to go over in the morning." "Before breakfast?" "Afterward. Then you can stay longer. You won't forget you promised?" She sighed. "Georgie, I make promises to dozens of boys every week, almost every day. I never yet have forgotten one of them. I promise you again, you'll see your rosebush tomorrow."